story of Elias Vance and what came to be known as the Silas Creek Anomaly began, as these things often do, with a quiet man and a piece of land nobody else much wanted. It was the late 1980s, deep in the undulating hills of rural West Virginia. Elias, a retired miner with a penchant for solitude, had bought a few dozen acres of overgrown, rocky terrain bordering the Monongahela National Forest. He wasn't looking for much, just a place to build a small cabin, hunt a little, and be left to his own thoughts. It was during the clearing of a particularly dense patch of rhododendron that he found it. Not a cave, not exactly a sinkhole, but something far more unsettling. A perfectly circular opening in the earth, perhaps 10 feet across, its edges unnervingly smooth, as if bored out by some colossal, unnatural drill. The surrounding rock showed no signs of fracture or collapse. It simply ended, giving way to an inky blackness that seemed to absorb the very light around it. Elias, a practical man, first assumed it was an old, uncharted mine shaft, though its perfect geometry was unlike anything he'd seen in his years underground. He tossed a few stones into the void. There was no satisfying clatter, no echo of impact. They simply vanished, swallowed by the silence. This was the first peculiarity. Over the next few weeks, Elias's curiosity grew. He fashioned a weighted line from a heavy wrench and a long coil of new rope he'd bought for hauling timber. He lowered it, foot by foot, into the hole. 10 feet, 50, 100. The rope unspooled with an eerie lack of resistance. He'd bought 300 feet, and all of it disappeared into the chasm without touching bottom. The silence from below was absolute, unnerving. His old coonhound, Daisy, who would follow him anywhere, refused to go within 50 yards of the opening. She'd whine, tuck her tail, and slink back towards the tree line, her hackles raised. Even the bird song seemed to hush the closer one got to the hole. Elias also noticed his battery-powered radio would crackle with static and then die if he brought it too near. A compass needle would spin erratically before settling on a random, incorrect bearing. He began to call it the Silas Creek Anomaly, after the nearby stream that trickled through his property. He started keeping a journal of its oddities. He'd lower various objects, old tools, tin cans, even a broken television. Nothing ever made a sound. It was as if they were falling into an infinite, soundproofed well. One particularly hot July day, he noticed a distinct chill emanating from the hole, a cold, damp air that smelled faintly of ozone and something else, something metallic and unfamiliar. Elias wasn't a man for gossip, but the anomaly weighed on him. He eventually confided in Martha Jenkins, the editor and sole reporter for the local weekly paper, the Pocahontas County Chronicle. Martha was a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, sharp-witted and always on the lookout for a story that wasn't about the annual pie contest or a lost cow. Initially skeptical, Martha agreed to visit the site. She brought her own camera and a more sophisticated audio recorder. The silence of the hole, the cold air, and Daisy's palpable fear intrigued her. She witnessed Elias lower another 100 feet of rope, tied to the previous length, and still find no bottom. Her recorder, when placed near the edge, picked up only a faint, almost subaudible hum, a vibration more felt than heard. Martha wrote a carefully worded piece, focusing on the geological curiosity, hinting at the local folklore of bottomless pits said to exist in the region, but steering clear of anything too outlandish. The article, however, generated a small ripple of local interest. A few curious townsfolk, and even a couple of amateur paranormal investigators from a nearby state, made inquiries. This is where Elias's quiet life began to unravel. One evening, a sleek, dark sedan with no discernible markings rolled up his long, unpaved driveway. Two men in dark, ill-fitting suits emerged. They didn't introduce themselves by name or agency, but their demeanor was unmistakably official and vaguely threatening. They asked Elias about the geological feature on his land, their questions precise and unnervingly knowledgeable. They advised him, in terms that brooked no argument, that further public discussion of the anomaly would be unwise and could have unforeseen consequences for his continued peaceful enjoyment of his property. Elias, shaken but not easily intimidated, told Martha. She, in turn, began to make discreet inquiries, trying to identify the men or the vehicle. Her efforts met with a wall of silence and a few not-so-subtle warnings from local officials to let sleeping dogs lie. A few weeks later, the men in the sedan returned, this time with a small convoy of unmarked trucks and a team of individuals in what looked like hazmat suits. They informed Elias that the area was being cordoned off for a comprehensive environmental survey due to potential subterranean gas leaks. He was offered a generous sum for temporary relocation and inconvenience, an offer he knew he couldn't refuse. His protests were met with polite but immovable insistence. From a vantage point on a neighboring ridge, Martha and a very reluctant Elias watched as the team set up a perimeter fence, erected temporary structures, and began to lower sophisticated-looking equipment into the Silas Creek Anomaly. Floodlights bathed the area in an eerie glow throughout the night. The faint hum Martha had recorded seemed to intensify, and even from a distance they could feel a strange thrumming in the air. Then, after about a week of intense activity, it all stopped. The vehicles left as silently as they had arrived. The temporary structures were dismantled. The perimeter fence remained, now adorned with stark, "No trespassing" U.S. government property signs. Elias, living in a small rented cabin in town, found his compensation was indeed generous, but it came with an unspoken understanding. His attempts to return to his land were met by armed guards who politely but firmly turned him away. Martha's further attempts to investigate were stymied. Her newspaper received an unexpected visit from a state environmental agency citing irregularities in her office's waste disposal, threatening fines that would bankrupt the small publication. The message was clear. The official explanation, when one was finally offered to the county, was that an old, unstable mine shaft had been identified and safely sealed to prevent environmental contamination and ensure public safety. The area, they said, would remain under federal observation. Elias Vance lived out the rest of his days in that rented cabin, a shadow of his former self. He rarely spoke of the anomaly, but Martha would visit, and sometimes, after a glass or two of bourbon, he'd pull out his old journal and stare at the pages, a haunted look in his eyes. He passed away in the mid-1990s, taking whatever further secrets he knew to his grave. Martha Jenkins eventually retired. The Pocahontas County Chronicle sold to a larger media group. The Silas Creek Anomaly, or what the government now called the Vance Reclamation Site, remained fenced off, guarded, and silent. Local stories persist, of course. Whispers of strange lights seen in the woods, of odd vibrations felt through the ground, of hunters' dogs that still refuse to go near that particular patch of land. Some say the hole was a gateway, a tear in the fabric of reality. Others believe it was a natural phenomenon, exaggerated by a lonely old man and an eager reporter. A few, more cynical, suggest it was all a government experiment from the start, and Elias Vance was simply an inconvenient witness. No independent verification of the hole's depth or its other alleged properties has ever been achieved. Satellite imagery of the area now shows only dense woodland, with a small, unremarkable clearing marked by a concrete cap, indistinguishable from countless other capped mine shafts across the state. But for those who remember Elias Vance's quiet conviction and Martha Jenkins's unnerving recordings of that almost inaudible hum, the Silas Creek Anomaly remains an unsettling enigma, a dark, silent question mark etched into the ancient heart of the West Virginian hills, a story that continues to whisper from the void.